Study Unit 9 consists of postmodern approaches that entails two specific therapies. First, solution-focused brief therapy, and secondly, narrative therapy. Please join us while we discuss both of these therapies in depth. The learning outcomes of this study unit are as follows. Demonstrate the postmodern approach to therapy by discussing solution-focused brief therapy and narrative therapy. Utilize theory and proof-based arguments to demonstrate the ability to handle unknown, concrete, and abstract problems. Discuss the approach's contributions to multicultural therapy and its shortcomings, and critically evaluate the approach. What is social constructionism? It explains how values are transmitted by the social environment through language and how individuals are constantly changing as a result of changing parental, cultural, and social influences. We will now look at the first postmodern approach called solution-focused brief therapy, or SFB therapy for short. It is a goal-oriented therapeutic approach that focuses more on one's future conditions and less on past experiences. This therapy was initially developed by Steve de Chazar and Insoo Kim Berg and adopts a future-oriented, optimistic, and contra-deterministic approach. For the purpose of substantiating solution-focused brief therapy, the Ellen Packies movie included in the additional resources will be used. The main focus is on behavior change and possible solutions, as behavior change is understood to be the most effective way to help people improve their lives. Therapists believe that it is not necessary to know what caused the problem in order to solve it. Although the practice of SFB therapy allows for a discussion and expression of clients' problems, it is only a brief exploration instead of a long investigation into their history. In Ellen Packies' case, the practitioner using the SFB therapy approach would pay little attention to Ellen's history of abuse and trauma. The practitioner would in this case focus more on Ellen's future and coming up with possible solutions for her problems. The positive assumption is that people do have the ability to solve the challenges they are faced with in life, but tend to lose their way and their awareness of their capabilities. The many hardships and negative thought processes that Ellen may be going through due to her abuse may have clouded her awareness of possible solutions. The therapist in this case would then challenge these negative views by having optimistic conversations with Ellen in an attempt to reframe her problem-saturated stories into possible positive goals and outcomes. Another key concept is looking for what is working. The focus of SFB therapy in this instance is to encourage clients to focus more on the exceptions to their problems, as well as on some examples of success. Essentially, to counter the problems they face, SFB therapy practitioners help their clients find out what solutions have previously worked for them in their problems. So in Ellen's case, the therapist would look together with Ellen for what has been working for her at some points in her life, or rather exceptions to her problems, which are those positive moments in her life in the midst of all her problems. There are many ways to ignite a client's awareness of this, but one way is to engage the client in a conversation that will lead to a narrative of progress, such as asking, "Tell me about what you would do to feel better about the situation when it occurred." Below is a guiding practice for basic assumptions. Firstly, clients have the ability to behave in an effective manner, but the effectiveness may be temporarily disturbed by some negative thought processes. Because Ellen, for instance, is in a negative mental and emotional state, she may be temporarily preventing herself from recognizing effective ways of dealing with problems. Secondly, a positive focus on solutions and on the future can be advantageous. If Ellen is able to focus more on the solutions instead of the problems she went through in the past, her therapy process could be brief. Thirdly, every problem has a moment of absence in a client's life, and every problem has an exception. Talking about these exceptions can ignite an awareness of solutions to clients, and this may lead to rapid changes. Fourthly, clients usually present one side of themselves. SFB therapy therapists examine the other side of the presenting story. Although very brief, the therapist in the case will try to examine the other side of Ellen's story. Fifthly, change will happen since no problem is constant. Clients must be aware of the small changes that occur as they often lead to bigger changes. Next, clients try their best to ignite change. Therapists must cooperate with clients instead of trying to come up with strategies to control resistance. This may reduce and diminish resistance. And lastly, clients' intent to solve their problems can be trusted. Therapists assume that clients want to change and that it is possible that they can and will change. Characteristics of brief therapy. The average therapy length is about 3 to 8 sessions, and the main goal of brief therapy is to help clients resolve problems efficiently and to move forward as quickly as possible. It's an expeditious working union between the client and the therapist. There is an expectation that change is not only possible but realistic, and that the client's improvement may occur in the immediate future. The orientation is based on the here and now, so the main focus is on the client's current functioning as it pertains to behavior, thinking, and feeling. In Ellen's case, the therapist's main focus will be directed to how Ellen is feeling and functioning in the current moment. The therapeutic process. A basic premise of a solution-focused therapeutic process is that a client is viewed as an expert in their own lives. Therefore, a client is considered to have a good sense of what has and has not worked in the past and what may work in the future. To prove this theoretical backdrop, in the Ellen Pakis movie, we see how Ellen, although not a beneficial solution, killed her son as a future solution for all the trauma she suffered at the hands of her son. This act transpired after Ellen has concluded all the solutions she tried in the past, for example, taking him to rehab, to the clinic and hospital, as well as praying for him, that did not work. Steps in the therapeutic process. Step 1. A client is given a platform to describe their issues while the therapist listens respectfully. Step 2. The therapist works well with the client to establish well-structured goals. Step 3. The therapist probes the client about periods when the client's issues were non-existent or less serious. Step 4. At the end of the solution-building conversation, the therapist provides the client with a feedback summary, offers encouragement, and proposes what the client may do before their next therapy session to deal with their problems. Step 5. The therapist and the client explore the progress made to reach effective solutions. Therapeutic goals. SFB therapy assists clients in developing well-defined goals that are expressed positively in the client's language, it's action-based, structured in the present, feasible, and controlled by the client. The therapist's function and role. It is important to note that the therapist assumes a not-knowing position and places the client in an expert position about their lives, and helps guide the client towards change without telling them on what to change. The therapeutic relationship. The outcomes of SFB therapy is dependent on the quality of the therapeutic relationship. Thus, it is important for a therapist to create an atmosphere of trust and encourage clients to continue with their therapeutic sessions and adhere to homework proposed by the therapist. There are 3 forms of relationships between clients and therapists. Firstly, the customer relationship entails clients and therapists to work collaboratively to identify an issue and solution that needs to be worked on. Secondly, compliance relationship. The client expresses a problem but cannot take on a role to create a solution. And thirdly, the visitor relationship, where the client goes to therapy because of others, for example, a parent, partner, or educator that thinks the client has an issue. Application of therapeutic techniques and procedures. It is crucial that solution-focused techniques are used with flexibility and tailored to the unique circumstances of every client. The first therapeutic technique is pre-therapy change. The booking of an appointment is often an indication of a positive change in emotion. Secondly, exception questions. SFB therapy takes the position that problems clients identify in their lives were at some point not problematic. These times are called exceptions. By working with clients to identify and examine these exceptions, the exceptions can be used to make some future changes. If there are identified exceptions, in Ellen's case, the therapist may ask her what has to happen for these exceptions to occur more often. The miracle and scaling questions. This incorporates the main SFB therapy technique. The miracle question essentially asked by the therapist is, if a miracle happened and overnight the problem was solved, what would be different and how would you know that the problem was solved? The client may point out something that would be different and the therapist would then produce hypothetical solutions. The scaling question. Whenever changes in human experience are difficult to observe, such as moods, feelings, or communication, a scaling question is used. Additionally, it may be used to help the client realize they aren't completely powerless over their problem. The question asked is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the first time you decided to come to therapy, and 10 being when the problem is resolved, how would you rate how you are feeling right now? Over time, the client's anxiety regarding their problem would decrease and even little progress is celebrated. Formula first session task is characterized by the form of homework assigned to a client by a therapist between the first and second therapy session. In the second therapy session, clients are required to reflect on their homework and state what they desire to happen in the future. This intervention provides clients with hope of change about their current and future circumstances. The therapist's feedback to the client. Solution-focused therapists use 5 to 10 minutes before the end of the therapy session to compile feedback to their clients. The feedback may involve the therapist identifying strengths, indications of hope, and exception to problems the client possesses. The components of the summary feedback consists of compliments, bridge, and suggesting tasks. Termination occurs when the client is capable of creating effective solutions and the therapy can be ended. Therapists can employ scaling questions to help clients monitor their progress and determine when they no longer need to attend therapy. Setting concise goals at the start of therapy provides a platform for effective termination of the therapeutic relationship. Application of solution-focused brief therapy to group counseling. At the start of therapy, the group facilitator creates a climate aimed at solution construction by allowing group members to briefly describe their problems. Solution-focused group therapists view clients as competent individuals that possess the ability to solve their own issues and live quality lives. The role of group facilitators are as follows. They assist group members to keep their problems external in discussions and to view themselves as being resourceful. They assist group members to keep track of solution-making processes rather than focusing on problems because SFB therapy is meant to be brief. They work collaboratively with group members to construct well-defined goals as soon as possible. They probe clients on a period when their problems were non-existent or less serious and explore these exceptions and focus on what they did to manifest their problems. Following this, group members will participate in distinguishing exceptions together. This enhances group process and encourages solution focus. Exceptions are real events that occur outside the context of the problem. Key interventions in solution-focused groups are questioning that allows presupposed change in clients and for them to remain goal and future-orientated. These questions are asked respectfully and out of genuine curiosity and interest. Advantages of solution-focused group therapy. It provides promise for practical and time-effective approach to interventions in school environments. It can shift focus from what is wrong in a student's life to what works for them in their lives. It provides an opportunity for school counselors to collaboratively achieve small and concrete changes that permit students to discover more productive directions. And lastly, this model has more to offer for school counselors liable for serving large learner caseloads in schools.
Now we will move on to narrative therapy. A narrative-oriented therapist will put a lot of emphasis on the fact that our lives are shaped by our stories. Both the therapist and the client work together collaboratively. The main focus is on the client's narration of their story. The therapist will then listen to these stories without any interruptions. The most essential goal of this therapy is to establish and reconstruct the stories that the clients tell. In narrative therapy, the client is not defined by their stories, but rather they are seen as resourceful and skillful in order to resolve their own problems that they are faced with. The main tasks of the therapist will be to find these competencies that the client has used before and that have been effective and useful in their progress. Change can only take place when the client is ready to accept it. The client has to first accept that they have the capability to change their story and make use of alternatives made available to them. We will now focus on some of the key concepts of narrative therapy. Narrative therapy focuses on a collaborative relationship between the therapist and the client. Therapists should engage in respectful listening and facilitation of the therapeutic process. It is very important for the therapist to avoid diagnosing and labeling their clients based on the problems that they are faced with. The role of stories can have a positive impact on the therapist because it is part of the unfolding process. The next key concept that we will be focusing on is listening with an open mind. This is an extremely important aspect of narrative therapy. A narrative therapist should understand the importance of encouraging a client to modify their beliefs and interpretations without actually imposing their values and beliefs onto that client. A narrative therapist should be able to listen attentively to their client's stories and be able to catch important details that may give some evidence into the client's ability to overcome these problems. The therapist should help the client in seeing their strengths and competencies even when the client is unable to see them. During the therapeutic process, narrative therapists will remove the person from the problem and then be able to listen attentively with understanding and be able to respond appropriately. There are certain steps that a narrative therapist may follow in their therapeutic process. Some of the basic steps include collaborating with the client, personifying their problem, investigating how disruptive this problem might be, encouraging the client to see the problem from a different perspective, discovering moments in the client's life where they were not dominated by this problem, finding historical evidence to bolster a new view of the client as a competent enough person to have stood up to this problem, ask the client to speculate about what kind of future could be expected from this new, strong and competent person who is developing. Lastly, it is important to find a support structure and audience for the new story and the new emerging competent person. It is very important to note that a narrative conversation does not follow a linear approach, but it rather follows a cycle. This cycle should include the following elements that you can see on this slide. One of the goals of narrative therapy is to invite the client to describe their experience in a new and fresh language. In doing so, they will be able to open up to new ideas of what is possible. This new language will help the client to develop new meanings for their problems, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Narrative therapy almost always includes an awareness of the impact of the various aspects of dominant culture on human life. Narrative practitioners try to enlarge the perspective and facilitate the discovery or creation of new options that are unique to the people that they see. One of the main roles of a therapist in narrative therapy may be that they should be active facilitators. Some of the other functions of narrative therapists may be found in page 393 in your textbook. The relationship between the client and the therapist is very important. Narrative therapists place great importance on the values and ethical commitments that a therapist may bring to therapy. Some of these attitudes include optimism and respect, curiosity and persistence, valuing the client's knowledge, and creating a special kind of relationship that is characterized by a real power-sharing dialogue. In narrative therapy, the quality of the therapeutic relationship is very important. The narrative therapist should then find creative ways to apply these therapeutic techniques and procedures to that specific client. The first technique that a therapist may follow is questions. Asking questions out of respect curiosity, and openness in mind is very important. The therapist should approach these questions from a position of not knowing. This means that they shouldn't ask questions to which they believe they already know the answers to. Externalizing and deconstructing. Within this technique, the client will form a relationship with the problem when they perceive it to be located outside of themselves. For example, there is a big difference between calling someone an alcoholic and implying that drinking has taken over their lives. Separating the problem from the person will allow the client to foster optimism and allow them to speak out against certain narratives, such as self-blame. It is important to note that externalizing conversations can be structured in 2 stages. Please read up more about this in your textbook on page 396. The next therapeutic technique involves searching for unique outcomes. This involves asking questions to the client that are both indirect and direct that may lead to the elaboration of a preferred identified story. For example, asking the question, was there ever a time in your life when anger tried to take control of you and you resisted? The therapist would then inquire, what was it like for you during that time? How did you pull it off? These questions are intended to draw attention to times when the problem did not exist or when it was successfully resolved. The following therapeutic technique involves alternative stories and reauthoring. This is when the therapist may ask the following question. Have you ever been able to escape the effect of the problem? The therapist might ask this question in order to listen for signals of competence or develop a story of competence around it. The therapist might also ask, what is the next move you might take, given what you have learned about yourself? Seeing as the client is more likely to think on what they have accomplished so far and what is the steps that they might take if they are asked such questions. The last therapeutic technique involves documenting the evidence. According to narrative practitioners, new stories can only take hold once there is an audience to appreciate and support them. Please see the example on the slide. When applying narrative therapy to group counseling, the narrative emphasis is on establishing an appreciative audience for new changes in an individual's life, which lends itself to group work. Groups provide a ready-made community of concern as well as numerous chances for the type of involvement that leads to new ways of life. We will now be discussing some of the strengths of postmodern approaches from a diversity perspective. One of the optimistic viewpoints that regard people as competent and capable of creating better solutions and more life-affirming stories is a crucial contribution of all postmodern approaches. Postmodern practitioners shift their focus away from what is wrong with a person and rather onto creative potential. Problems are seen as everyday obstacles and tasks rather than abnormal manifestations. When a therapist listens to the client and their experiences, they look for facts that show the client is capable of confronting these oppressive experiences. Questioning is a strength of both solution-focused and narrative treatments, since it can help the clients develop their stories and find better methods to deal with their current worries, as well as thinking about how they might address future problems. Individuals can use effective questioning to examine their tales and come up with new methods to tell them. We will now be discussing some of the shortcomings of both solution-focused and narrative therapies. Many of these shortcomings stem from the therapist's lack of experience in applying these approaches. Although both solution-focused and narrative therapists have a variety of strategies at their disposal, the therapist's mindset is very crucial in the success of these outcomes. Therapists should be trained in brief interventions in order to practice solution-focused brief therapy effectively. This means that practitioners can do quick assessments, aid clients in defining specific goals, and effectively deploying suitable therapies in a relatively short amount of time. There is no recipe, no predetermined goal, and no formula that the therapist can follow in order to ensure desired outcomes in narrative therapy. These are not necessarily limits, but the approaches used will have a limited therapeutic benefit unless the therapist is actually psychologically and professionally mature. We have now reached the end of our PowerPoint. We would like to thank you for engaging with the content, and we really hope that you have enjoyed this PowerPoint. Please note that if you have any questions, please feel free to post it on Ifundi and we will get back to you as soon as possible.